Where did this start? Why did you join the Army? That's first of all. Where are you from and why did you join the Army?
Oh, gosh. I was 5 years old, and my mother took me to West Point on a visit. And after I had visited the place, I told her I'm going to go to West Point. So I think that's where it began. And I really never deviated from that path. I mean, one of the reasons I went to Virginia Military Institute for a year was that I had not been appointed the first time around to West Point. And I really didn't know much about VMI. My grandfather, I grew up in my maternal grandfather's home. He summoned me to his room and announced to me that he had found a place for me to spend a year before I ultimately went to West Point. And he said, it's a place called VMI. You will like it. You will enjoy it very much. Of course, when I reported to VMI on the first day and someone stopped me on the way through the Jackson Arch and said, give me 72 push-ups for the class of 72, I then discovered that my grandfather was a sick sadist because I said, this is not necessarily what I signed up for. So VMI was probably the best thing that ever happened to me because nothing could have prepared me better. And it also was a place that inculcated strong values of service and integrity and honor and so forth in ways that I don't think we did nearly as well at West Point. And I saw many standards of discipline at that point in 1971 in terms of your appearance and drilling and marching and all these kinds of things were vastly superior to what I found later on going to West Point. And later I read the Patton papers, and I found that General Patton's comments about West Point and VMI mirrored my own. One of the things he said, well, West Point is a much more gentlemanly atmosphere. No one can touch you. Whereas at VMI could touch you. And I do remember an upper class, he was a first classman. And I don't really to this day completely know what the hell I did. But he pulled me out of the rat line and held me up against the wall for doing something. And then he said, do you understand? And of course, I wasn't going to say no. I have no goddamn idea what you're talking about. I said, yes, sir. And he put me back in the rat line and off I went. And of course, we had all these horror stories, most of which are true about what it was like in the rat line in those years. I mean, you would run in place until you threw up. And then when you were finished throwing up, you would run again some more. I mean, it was a much rougher environment, but it was a good preparation for the military academy. It gave me a different perspective because most of the people that go to West Point are 18, straight out of high school. They've never seen anything else. That's all they know. And so there's no ability to sort of stand back, evaluate what is or isn't good or what might be different. So from the very beginning, I was inclined to think a little differently about things. Second thing that had a big impact on me was being an exchange student in Germany from 1969 to 1970. And I went to a very fine Quaker men's private school. I was raised as a Quaker, believe it or not. And I competed for a spot to study in Germany, and the American Friends Services Committee sent me to northern Germany to a town in English called Brunswick, Braunschweig in German. And I ended up living with a family the father of which had been an officer in the Wehrmacht and had actually served in the German army from about 1931 till 1945. And he had seen a lot of action. He was a combat engineer. But typical for the officer class, very well educated, his hobby was Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and biblical texts. He was very interested in archaeology and so forth. He had a big impact because he eventually discovered that I was not going to reproach him for being an evil Nazi. I just wanted to know about him and his experiences in the military. And then he began to teach me a great deal. And so an awful lot of what happens in 1991 and 1990, 91, when I had the opportunity to sort of mold the 2nd Squadron, 2nd Cavalry for action, these 1,100 men, 42 tanks, 42 Bradleys, 8 guns. And then subsequently what I'm able to do with the 1st and the 4th Cavalry after the war from 92 to 94 really reflected that German influence. Because the Germans were very, very big on simplicity, big on what I would call orders from the saddle. In other words, discarding these detailed written orders in favor of a highly trained, battle drill-oriented force, to the point where the battle drills were automatic, and then you would improvise based on the existing battle drill to deal with the situation that you encountered, which you knew was always going to be a little different from what you originally intended or anticipated. And then the idea that you have to be at the front. I had to fight very hard to be in a tank. And the reason I wanted a tank was it was simply faster to move in that, and it was nothing that you could not do. And if you had to fight to influence the battle, you could have a profound impact with just one tank. So I ended up doing that, and then when I was at Fort Riley, the NTC provided a wonderful test ground to test out some other ideas and things, and I had 12 NCOs and officers who'd served with me in the 2nd Cavalry who joined me in the 1st and the 4th. So I had a good cadre there that understood the thinking, the rationale, and it paid huge dividends. Now, it didn't make me very popular, and some of the people that went on to command battalions and squadrons later on who were captains or majors, he told me the first thing they got when they showed up at a division was that we don't want any of this McGregor stuff. Don't come in here and try to do anything new or different. Just do your job. In other words, don't question anything. Just go and do what everybody else does. And one of the things that I didn't like was this notion of, well, you learn by failing. My argument was, well, you can, but you also learn by success. And if you do something and it works, you don't forget it. You can do it again. You don't have to fail at everything on the assumption that having failed, you've learned something. What if you didn't learn how to do it better? Or just because you failed, well, that didn't work, what else are we going to do? And I found that most of what the U.S. Army doctrine was telling people to do made no sense. It was going to get everybody killed in a real fight with a real enemy. Now, we haven't had to deal with that very much, fortunately, and so we've kind of atrophied. And we spend too much time congratulating ourselves on how wonderful we are and how much better we are than everybody else. It's a catastrophe. So my personal nightmare from 91 onward was really that we would end up like the Prussian army at Jena Auerstedt in 1806. The Prussians went out there and they were essentially organized, trained, and equipped exactly as they had been under Frederick the Great during the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763. So they were this permanent tribute or replica of the army that was successful in 1763 and 1806. Along comes the Grand Army under Napoleon, and we know the rest of the story. They annihilated the Prussians, destroyed them. So my concern is that we end up with somebody we didn't expect who has figured out ISR, strike, maneuver, and sustainment, how to integrate those, has changed the way it fights, and ultimately devastates us. And I testified in 2017 in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Air-Land Subcommittee, and I tried to make that point, but it fell on deaf ears. And I tried to describe what we would experience. The first thing, you get to the battlefield, there are all sorts of sensors operating, and those are not all obvious, but the point is that forms of overhead surveillance are going to detect you as well as things on the ground. The next thing that happens is loitering munitions that come in to pick and choose from the various targets on the ground. In other words, command and control or logistics, whatever they decide is important. And then very shortly after these things are confirmed, in comes the rocket artillery, and the tactical ballistic missiles are headed over your head to destroy the command and control structure behind you. As this all happens very quickly, and you have to organize for this. You have to be widely dispersed, which puts a premium on leadership at the lowest level. But you also have to have tactical air and missile defense. You have to have the ability to acquire these things, because if you've got tactical air and missile defense and you have radars that allow you to acquire these things, you can defeat the things above you. But at the same time, you've got to move. If you are static for any length of time, you're going to be found, targeted, and destroyed. So all of these things were not widely appreciated, and everybody sort of said, oh, well, that's nice. And now we're beginning to see it. We've seen it in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Armenia. We've gotten a good taste of it from the Azeri Turks using the loitering munitions and rocket artillery. It's the tip of a proverbial iceberg.
I'm curious, because I know you graduated with an engineering degree. Am I correct on that?
Yes, we all got Bachelor of Science in General Engineering, which was very tough on me because I needed a case of no-dos to get through most of those subjects.
So the reason I ask it, because when I look at your biography and I look at your history, I'm talking to myself, here's an engineer, here's a person. And again, when I think of engineer, I think of civil or mechanical engineer. I'm like, here's a person who lives in a world of rules, of systems, of proven systems. But then I see your performance at 73 Easton, at NTC, your book, Breaking the Phalanx, which it really is, this was, if I remember correctly, getting rid of divisions, of breaking units down to 5,000 to 6,000 men. In fact, I read a book a long time ago about command and control. Was it Crevel? And I think you talk about how the Romans, the legion was just an administrative word. It was the actual cohorts. And I'm like, so I just, to me, it's almost like a paradox. Here's a person who thrived in a system built of rules, and yet you're such a global thinker, and you put it on paper, and you had, from my reading, it was required reading for generals, except you became the tallest poppy in the field. And
I think that's a good way to describe it. Yeah. And, it came very close to implementation, many of these things. General Reimer was the chief of staff at the time. He spent almost 3 hours with me, and then he said, at the end of the discussion, he said, I think you're right, number one. Number two, I know we can do this. He said, three, I know that the joint community will welcome this, these mission-focused capability packages under 1-stars. He said, I know that the Hill will like this. But he said, how do I sell this in the Army? And the full colonel that had commanded me in 91 was then a 3-star. His name was Holder. And General Holder looked at him and said, well, sir, you're the chief of staff of the Army. Well, they ultimately, this was in February, I guess, or March. And in May or late April, they had a meeting with the Army 4-stars. I guess they had 7 of them at the time. And believe it or not, they voted on this sort of blueprint that I had outlined. And there was 1 vote for it, and everyone else was against it. And so Reimer said, well, I can't implement this. That's no way to run an army.
No.
And one of the things I keep trying to tell people is in 1940-41, during the Louisiana maneuvers, they discovered a lot of things. One of the things they discovered was that they needed to organize into the German battle groups inside the armored divisions. We used to call them combat commands. They also had finally gone to triangular divisions, which again was another German innovation from the early 20s. And that had been fought tirelessly for 17, 18 years. But they were still fighting the combat command structure and instead wanted to have this large amorphous armored division. Marshall listened to it. He said, all right, all armor divisions will be converted to combat command divisions. Next question. And there was this huge sigh of relief from the people that were in those formations that were trying to do these things. You have to have someone in charge. See, the problem in the Department of Defense right now is no one's in charge. This is the problem in imaginary, fictional. You have services. The service chiefs have all the money. The service chiefs are preeminently concerned about keeping what they have and changing nothing. Oh, they'll buy some new gadgets, but as far as altering the structure, changing the way they fight, forget it. They're not interested in that because their structure is tied to career patterns, tied to promotion systems, tied to bureaucratic policies with which they are all comfortable. So I finally concluded that there are only 2 ways things change. One is war, and the other is revolution. Sometimes you get one before the other. Sometimes you get both together, and then you get changes. But rarely do you get fundamental change. I did have a couple of examples with the British before World War I, which is the first chapter. They actually did make a lot of changes that made a lot of sense. The problem was that the army was never designed to go to France and fight on that kind of battlefield against the greatest army in the world, the Imperial German Army. It was designed to go to India. It was designed to go to the Baltic littoral. It was designed to do all sorts of things, but not for the purpose for which it was ultimately destined. The Germans got a lot of things right, but they never got it all right because they didn't have the resources and there wasn't enough leadership at the top to make it happen. And the Soviets were in a different position. They took terrible losses. They had us replenishing everything, and ultimately were able to get most of it right, at least on the operational level. And on the operational level, that's very important, and we've never understood that. I mean, I give an example of Eisenhower spends, 8 or 9 months negotiating with the Army Air Corps about targets that he wants to attack in Normandy. And finally, after 8 or 9 months of struggling, there's an agreement reached. Well, one of the things that was impressive about Operation Bagration that you pointed to was that Zhukov at one point, who is commanding one of the three groups of fronts, finds that there are 50,000 German troops encircled outside of Minsk. And this time the Germans can't break out because they're encircled by armor and artillery, not infantry. He then turns to his, what we would call strike commander, and says, I want every available aircraft immediately to attack these Germans who are surrounded. Within 15 minutes, you get over 1,000 aircraft over the battlefield that absolutely annihilate these Germans, most of whom are infantry that have nowhere to hide on the battlefield. Incomprehensible. But there's also this other lesson that comes through again and again and again, and that is, if you have no unity of command, there is no unity of effort. We never really had unity of command. Even the Germans had problems with unity of command. For instance, as the German army was advancing to Stalingrad, the army commanders begged the German Air Force not to bomb Stalingrad, because it was their experience that a bombed out city was more difficult to take than a city that was intact. Well, the commander of German air forces in southern Russia ignored them.
I've always called the Germans, they always had a divided division of labor. It's amazing.
And when you look at the command structure in air-land battle, it's a catastrophe, because you have all these single service headquarters, and you are spending yourself into bankruptcy trying to connect all of them. And that's not the answer. The answer is, instead of 40 or 50 single service headquarters, the answer is 10 or 15 that are integrated, inherently joint, that have all the connectivity they need, but there is unity of command at every level. We don't have it. We don't want it. The Russians have it. They've learned. Now, the interesting thing is the Chinese really don't have it, but it's by design, because the Chinese political leadership doesn't trust the military, and they have a long history of warlordism in China. And so they're afraid of regional commanders trying to strike out on their own and do their own thing. So the Chinese are by design fragmented. We really don't understand the vast differences between China and Russia. We tend to lump them all together. And China is, I would say, very incapable of offensive operations. The only thing they can do very well is defend China. And if you look at their investments and the way they're set up, they're turning China into Fortress China, designed to essentially prevent us from interfering with them. The Russians are entirely different. They have an offensive mindset. Their force structure is more agile, and they're quite capable now of offensive operations. Limited because they don't have the money or the numbers, but it's a vast difference between them and the Chinese.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating. I promised you 1 hour, and I'm going to keep my word. For the audience here, I know you mentioned you spent 1 year at VMI. For the audience, the rule of VMI is if you survive your rat year, you're actually a VMI grad. So,
well, you're an alumnus.
Alumnus, yes, you're an alumnus. So it's really, I thoroughly appreciate you taking your time to talk to me. Again, I'm a big fan. Your book, Margin of Victory, and I'll have the information on the website. I highly recommend to the listeners, read it. It is amazing. again, the writing's so crisp and clear, but your ability to analyze, to really take apart all the critical elements. And frankly, again, the theme that wars are decided in the decades before they begin is so powerful. If you're an executive, you need to learn to do the right things now, because in the next year or two, who knows what's going to happen? You should be better prepared. So
I was talking to an audience recently about the book, and I said, look, I know that people don't like to read books. So do what most West Point cadets do. Everybody sort of stopped to listen. I said, read the introduction and read the concluding chapter, if nothing else. Of course, everybody laughed, but I was quite serious. If you don't want to work your way through these 5 battles, which are really 5 snapshots in time to understand the issues that you pointed to, this development of this ISR strike capability over time, and how this all begins 10, 20 years before the battle, then at least read the introduction and conclusions. We have too many people in the military that are absorbed with what I call the bright, shining object. Oh, there's a new technology I can buy that'll do this nifty thing for me. It's not the answer. It's holistic. And our problems in defense, much like our problems in many other areas, are structural and require comprehensive change. That, of course, is the thing that nobody wants to do. And sadly, when you don't do it, or make a pretty damn good attempt to do it, that's when you end up having to do it after you have been badly embarrassed